Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Tuesday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with our Tuesday Tidbits. I hope everyone had an awesome Father's Day. And as expected, we had a very hot day, but no rain, so that was a good thing. On a personal level, I did have a good Father's Day. We ended up going to Fleming's Steakhouse in the Dr. Phillips area. It's one of our favorite places when we have special occasions. They've got a good menu, excellent steaks, and they have other good items too there. And their service is really good. So we had a great time. Moving on to real estate and what's going on. I thought I wanted to share with you guys today some things that could potentially happen in real estate and why it's important to really be aware of dates and also to make sure that whoever your agent is keeping you well apprised of that and explaining potential issues that could take place if dates aren't adhered to. I have one transaction, for example, that as a normal transaction had a 10-day inspection period. And it just so happens the lender was really on top of things. So we've gotten the appraisal back. The appraisal was done rapidly, and there were no issues with the appraisal. The appraisal came in at what we call value. So that means that if you sold a house for $1 million and it had an appraisal contingency, the appraisal to alleviate any issues had to come back at $1 million. So this house, that's what happened. It came back at the contract price, so we're good to go on that end. And the lender's on top of things, so we should have no issues whatsoever in closing this transaction on time. The thing that's a little bit unusual and sometimes can cause misunderstandings is our appraisal deadline actually expired last evening at midnight. And I hadn't heard anything regarding the inspection from the buyer's agent. So what that means from a legal perspective is that they've waived their inspection rights. In other words, they can't legally demand any repairs be done if anything was found on their inspection that they wanted addressed because they didn't address that during the inspection period. And secondly, let's say they want things done and the seller, per the contract, says, well, I'm sorry, but you waived your rights because you didn't notify us during the inspection period. And then the buyer, let's say, reacts negatively and says, well, if those items or item isn't addressed, then I'm not going to buy the home. Then that buyer is in breach of contract. So what does that mean from a legal perspective? Well, again, I'm not a lawyer, but these are things that you run into from time to time in real estate. Well, a breach of contract in this case, since it's pretty clear cut, means that if they decide to pull out of the deal at this point over an inspection issue and we're unable to rectify it to everybody's satisfaction, then they be subject to forfeit their deposit, what we call their earnest money deposit. And they do have a fair amount in escrow, so they're not going to be happy about forfeiting their money. And if they're like a lot of customers, they'll probably try to contest that. However, from a contract point of view, they clearly are in breach. And so they're not going to have a legal foot to stand on if they try to claim their deposit back. And sometimes when I'm dealing with other agents, I think they're just oblivious to these things. I think it's either due to a lack of training or they don't really understand the importance of staying on schedule. The reason you have dates in a contract, whether it's the inspection date, whether it's the closing date, whether it's the loan approval date, these things are all very important. And if those dates are not met, different issues can arise from that. So I always tend to be two things: A, proactive, and B, kind of what I call anal. I'm proactive in that I try to make sure well in advance that anything that I have control over, I've taken care of to make sure that my customers' rights are fully intact and that I try to alleviate on any transaction I'm involved in stress, disagreements, and potential problems. Secondarily, I try to make sure that my customers cooperate with me when I explain to them why these dates are so important, especially if you're working with a buyer. The first step in the process is to get the inspections done as quickly as possible. And then if any issues do come back, you have time to negotiate with the seller. Or if you want a third opinion, you can get a specialist out there. Like, let's say an inspection came back, and according to your inspector, there were roof issues. Well, besides going with the inspector's perspective, you might want to get your own roofer out there to give an opinion on the roof. How long the roof has as a useful life, what, if any, problems it has. If you address those problems, what's the potential cost for the repairs, things of that nature. So that's why those things are very important. Like, since I mentioned roofs, one of the things that I try to be proactive about nowadays, when I list a property, if the roof is older, let's say 15 years or more, then I discuss the potential pitfalls of that roof with the seller, if for no other reason than potential insurance issues, because with as many issues as we have with the insurance companies in Florida, which really, I won't get on that soapbox, but it's kind of a travesty. If you have an older roof, it can create issues in getting that house insured properly. And obviously, if a buyer is getting a mortgage on a house, they have to have insurance for the deal to close. So there's just different issues. So that's why I make the sellers aware of these potential issues and give them potential remedies or situations that could pop up, and give them my insight into how we can keep that transaction on track while at the same time protecting the seller's interest at all costs. So there's just a lot of different nuances with that. So, a lot of times people think that selling a house is a simple prospect, but it's really not. Some sales are hopefully pretty straightforward. Everything goes smoothly. Everybody goes to closing. Everybody's happy, smiling, and the stress level was minimized. Other transactions, you have different things that pop up, sometimes through no fault of anybody, and then you have to deal with those situations, and it causes more time and effort. It could possibly cause a delay. It causes more stress. So it kind of evens out in the wash. In other words, if you do a certain percentage of deals each year, some of the deals are going to be a lot easier to complete than others, and that's just the way the industry is. It's funny, though, like with some sellers, you might do a deal perfectly. You've done everything you're supposed to. You've made the deal so perfect for the sellers, and it closes really easily. And then the seller says, gee, you didn't have to do anything to close that one. And then they kind of infer that, hey, you made this large fee, and you really didn't have a lot of strain in it. But they don't know that behind the scenes, you've positioned everything. You priced it properly. You negotiated it well. You anticipated any issues, and you closed it smoothly. And that's what hopefully you try to do. On the flip side, there's some deals that have a lot of issues, may not be the fault of anybody, or it may be in the transaction you're working with, the other agent's not doing their share, so you're having to do more things and kind of correct the other agent's mistakes. And so on that deal, you did far more than you should have to do. But obviously you're not charging more. It kind of all comes out in the wash. So there's just a lot of nuanced things, and I find those things interesting and how people perceive those things. Another situation that I'm coming across sometimes is you'll place a house for sale, and it's a nice house, but nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical house in a nice neighborhood. And you get an offer in that's a lesser offer. And so even though you've gone over a lot of things with your sellers, a lot of times when they get a lesser offer, their initial reaction is very negative, and they take personal affront to that, and then they don't want to negotiate at all with the buyer. And obviously that feeling is understandable, but at the same time, it's not always practical because a lot of people try to negotiate whether they're successful or not. And probably more importantly right now, as I mentioned in my last few podcasts, we're going through a transition period. So the amount of listings in a lot of areas is exceeding the amount of buyers looking for homes. So we're transitioning from a seller's market into somewhat of a buyer's market. So if you're a seller, you have to be aware of that. You have to look at the data objectively. And then you have to realize that you need to be psychologically a little bit more flexible if you want to have a successful result. And some sellers are more low-key about that than others, and that's an important part of our job in effective communication with our customers. Also, we know from experience that if a house doesn't sell within a certain amount of time, it typically is going to take even longer to sell and sell at a lesser price. And that time frame varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, but I always use kind of a rule of thumb. If a listing in a popular area doesn't sell, let's say, within 4 weeks, even in this type of market, you're going to encounter some of those dynamics. And right now, buyers have more opportunities to look at homes. They're going to do a lot more comparative shopping. And if one house doesn't work out, they may have a couple alternatives that are close runner-ups. So from a buyer's perspective, they have a different perspective, obviously, than a seller's. So it's our job as the agents to communicate that perspective to our customer. I always tell my sellers, well, put yourself in the shoes of the buyer, and I tell my buyers to put themselves in the shoes of the seller. Also, some of the things that I tell buyers, if you make offers really low, you do run the risk of the sellers taking the offer really negatively and not negotiating at all, where if they had gotten a more realistic offer, they probably would have been more negotiable. Also, about putting in too many one-sided terms, like the buyer comes in with a lesser offer, they want a bunch of closing costs, they offer a small earnest money deposit, they want to have a longer inspection period. There's just different things that can make the offer less appealing to the sellers. From the seller's point of view, what are some of the things that they can make less appealing in this type of market? Well, depending on the closing date, does the seller want to close yesterday or do they want to close in 3 months? Well, obviously, a lot of your buyers that you're working with were in mid-June. They want to close before school starts. So they're looking about 7 weeks from now. So if a seller says they don't want to close for 12 weeks, that may be a turnoff for a lot of buyers. On the other hand, if it's an occupied property and the sellers want to close in 20 days, the buyers, if they want to close in 20 days, that may be a problem because the sellers may not be able to move to their next location within 20 days. So there's just a lot of dynamics that take place. So we do a lot of things behind the scenes, so to speak. But the thing that I'm always really adamant about, and I try to really go to the extremes on this, is to be detailed, have effective and smooth and respectful communication with my customer, keep my customer apprised on all aspects of the transaction, and try to get my customer to be reasonable in their response to the other side. I always used to use this analogy when I trained agents. I'd rather write 3 offers and have 3 closings than write 12 offers and have 4 closings, because I've made better use of my time. I'm enjoying myself more. I have less stress. I've done the right thing for my customers. Where if I wrote 12 offers and 4 of them closed, well, then I have 8 disappointed buyers. So I either didn't communicate properly or presented unrealistic offers in some cases. And sometimes you're dealing in a market where you might have multiple offers. So the way that you structure your offer is even more important. On the flip side, if you're in a buyer's market, well, then the sellers have to take that into account when they counteroffer. Otherwise, they might have a much longer boarding process before they successfully sell their home. So those are some of the things that I wanted to go over, and hopefully this has given you a little bit of nuance to the real estate industry. Last but not least, two quick sports things. Oklahoma City beat the Indiana Pacers last night in the Game 5. So now they're ahead 3-2 going to Indiana for Game 6. At the beginning of the playoffs, I picked Oklahoma City to win in 5 games, which obviously they haven't done. I think Game 6 should be a real barn burner, and I think it can go either way. I'm reasonably confident, however, that Oklahoma City will end up on top, whether it's 6 games or 7 games. And for those that are golf fans, we had the U.S. Open, which is one of the 4 majors in golf that just ended on Sunday. And a relatively unknown player, J.J. Spahn, won the golf tournament. It was in one of the hardest venues in the country, Oakmont in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was had bad weather, and let's say that it was just very unusual the way things proceeded. J.J. Spahn started off with 5 bogeys in the first 6 holes in the last round. Looked like he was going to self-destruct, but he ended up coming back and surprising to everyone, especially for a player of his caliber that had never won a major. He ended up winning it. And he highlighted his win on the last hole. He was 1 stroke up, and he was 65 feet away from the cup, which is a long distance in golf. So he was hoping to get a 2-putt so he maintained his 1-stroke victory. And he made the 65-foot putt, which was miraculous, and ended up winning by 2 strokes. So you never know what's going to go on. The thing I like about sports, it's one of the few events that takes place in our society that has a true ending. It's not pre-planned. You don't have people that are acting. It's spontaneous, and it's one of the few things that we still have that's spontaneous, and you can rely on the result as being pretty honest usually. That's all for today. Everybody have a good rest of the week. We look forward to talking with you on Friday. This is Marty Kaiser out.